And in the third round of interviews, one of the adoptive fathers said to me, the issue is no longer adoption, it's just life. Life is a challenge. Stuff happens and it's hard. And adoption as an issue just sort of fades into the background.
Hello and welcome back to the Partnership Connections podcast. This podcast is centered around child welfare training and educational topics, all with the goal of helping to support those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier, and I'm the project director for the Learning Partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost to hardworking professionals and others. Please note a disclaimer that all the opinions and views expressed by both the host and guests do not necessarily reflect those of DCYF or the college. So today we have a very special guest, and we're very excited to have her. We're going to be talking about this adoption, and I think we have someone who's going to be able to help us with a thing or two to learn more about this complex topic. Deborah Siegel is a professor emerita in the School of Social Work at Rhode Island College, where since 1983, she has taught graduate courses addressing clinical and policy practice in child welfare. Her practice as a clinical social worker, consultant to adoption and child welfare agencies, researcher, and legislative advocate has focused on foster care and adoption, addressing the concern of birth parents pre- and post-adoption, and adoptees of all ages. A little bit about sort of why we're here, and this is obviously an important topic to talk about, but recent data shows that 655 children in Rhode Island have been in out-of-home placements for at least a year, excluding children and youth in the Voluntary Extension of Care, or VEC program in Rhode Island. And according to the Rhode Island Kids Count, on January 1st of this year, there were 95 children in the care of DCYF who were waiting to be adopted. Of these children, 24% were under age 6. And of the 95 children waiting to be adopted, 29% were children of parents whose parental rights had been legally terminated. So just a little bit of background information. But Deborah, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show, and great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Stan, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today and chat a little bit about this topic. So can you tell us a little bit about your own personal journey to being an adoptive parent? What factors led to the decision-making? Is there anything you would have maybe done differently or the same? And how do you think the process would have been different if you were doing it today?
Great questions. Well, I think my journey started before I was born, because child welfare issues reach far back into my family of birth intergenerationally. My parents were born in the 1920s. Their parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. And it was highly unusual at that time for families to divorce. But my mother's parents broke up, mostly due to poverty, and my father's parents divorced due to domestic violence, substance use, and poverty. And this was before 1935, when the Social Security law was passed, creating AFDC, welfare payments, as well as the Social Security system. There was no aid for families, for mothers. Usually the kids were left with the mothers, no aid for mothers with children. And my mother's mother had 3 kids. My father's mother had 3 kids. The fathers were gone. And the mothers had to go to work in the garment industry in New York City, spending their days at a sewing machine, leaving their kids completely unsupervised. Mm-hmm. So my mother and her 2 siblings ended up in a place called the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. And my father and one of his 3 siblings ended up in the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. His 3rd sibling, who was under age 5, ended up in foster care, and actually ended up having a very different life trajectory than my father, who, like my mother, was in congregate care. Right. So I grew up with stories about how necessary it is for society to have a plan in place, because when you have to depend totally on private charity, things fall apart. There was a lot of child abuse in the institution where my parents were raised, and they didn't get the benefit of having a consistent caregiver. And we know a lot about that now. So that's sort of where my journey began. Then my interest in adoption got piqued through my teaching. I was assigned to teach courses at the graduate level in child welfare. And despite my family's personal experiences with child welfare issues, I plunged into the literature, which is what you do when you're an academician and you're given a teaching assignment and you don't really know much about it. As one of my colleagues once said years ago, if you can teach anything if you're a lifelong learner and really diligent and assertive about finding out what we know based on the literature and based on the personal experiences of people with the issue. That was where I discovered in the literature the idea of open adoption. That idea had never occurred to me before because I grew up with all the misconceptions and myths about adoption that most people have. My first teaching experience in child welfare issues was in the 1980s, so that's quite a while back. That led me to have a lot of curiosity about open adoption. And when it came time for my husband and me to plan a family, I thought, I'd really like to do this. I think I have some intergenerational issues to address through my own experience and this newly discovered topic of openness and adoption. And that's pretty much how my own adoption adventure personally unfolded. I can remember a key moment. I used to swim laps every morning before work. That went by the wayside once I became a parent for obvious reasons. But I remember swimming back and forth in the pool where I did laps in the morning before work, thinking, could I really love a child who's not born to me? Can I really do that? And I had an epiphany while swimming that I loved my cat, Kitsy, as if she had been born to me, and she wasn't even the same species as I. And that was a pivotal moment for me when I realized, yeah, I can do this. Right. I can do this.
Yeah. So what do you think about knowing that you had that background and you were sort of delving into the research already and you had that perspective? Let's say, for example, you didn't have that. How would that have looked differently if you didn't? Or was it really just because of your own experience in the academic realm and your own personal experience that you were interested in that? Do you think you would have been interested if it wasn't for that?
That's a great question. I think there was a little bit of child saver in me. That was a piece of my own wounds from having seen what my parents went through, not having had a family, right? I had a lot of empathy. And in my professional work as a clinician, of course, I was assigned cases in Illinois, Missouri, in Alabama, and then in Rhode Island, states where I had lived. I had cases where the client was a child who was in foster care, or a child who had been adopted and was experiencing issues. So I was learning from the children themselves how hard it was to be adopted. And that was very much at odds with what people in general seem to think. They seem to think that, oh, isn't adoption the happy part of social work?
Sure, yeah.
I want to be, I started my teaching in a BSW program, undergraduate social work in Alabama at Auburn University. And my undergraduate students would say, well, I want to go into adoption because it's so happy. And people just didn't seem to understand that there is no adoption without loss. And that, yes, the children are glad to have a family. And yes, the family receiving the child is happy to have a child. But that happiness does not supersede or take away the losses that the children and the parents also brought with them into the journey as an adoptive family. So lots of different threads converged in my life. I was also concerned not only about correcting some kind of cosmic wrong metaphorically, which of course is grandiose and never really happens, but very moved by how many children didn't have a family.
So you felt it's like sort of some personal responsibility in a way?
To some extent, although I don't think personal responsibility is a legitimate reason to become a parent, period.
Right.
And I certainly don't think it's a reason to become an adoptive parent. I think the only reason to become a parent, and this is my own view, is that you want to be a parent and you want to parent a child. There's no other reason that's going to get you through it. Because the journey is tumultuous. Even in the best of circumstances, people who become parents by birth have a tumultuous journey. And people who become a parent by adoption have a different kind of tumultuous journey. And the tumult includes lots of joy, lots of delights, and lots of challenges. Life is a challenge.
Once you had that epiphany, was that sort of the upward trajectory that you needed to then be comfortable with the decision, or did you have any further trepidation after that? Or was
I had lots of trepidation, Sure, because my parents came from troubled families. And I did not want to recreate that intergenerational theme. I wanted a different theme.
If you were going through the same process today, how do you think it would look different?
Well, the landscape of adoption today is totally different than in the 1980s. We adopted our first child in 1988. And both of our adoptions are domestic infant adoption through the private system. So that's quite different in a lot of ways than adopting through the public child welfare system. And the thought at the time was that that would sidestep some of the challenges of early life trauma, that the children would not have experienced abuse and neglect, and the traumas of having to leave a family and go into a foster family and then leave a foster family and go into an adoptive family. But the landscape today is very different. I think among professionals, it's pretty commonly accepted that today most people have experienced trauma. And also the word epigenesis had not really entered the lexicon. Epigenesis means that when a person experiences trauma of some sort, be it starvation or war or abuse or having a parent who's really impaired for some reason medically or in terms of mental health or economic distress, that can turn on latent genes, which is why two people who, for example, may have a family history of bipolar, one person might end up actually having bipolar disorder where another person with a similar gene pool won't. That stress can turn on the bipolar disorder. And then when a person has a particular disorder and they have a child, that can be transmitted to the child that they have. And that's totally ignited my interest in social justice, in eradicating poverty, inequality, and all that sort of thing, because those things create. Epigenesis means the intergenerational transmission of those challenges that are generated by the environment.
You did a lengthy sort of longitudinal study that you talked about in the training that you provided for us. Can you tell us what motivated you to do that study in the first place? Did it have anything to do with your own personal journey? Was it more focused on your academic background and interests?
I think it was both. My personal journey was very much a part of it. I really wanted to know, at the point that I started that study, we had adopted our first child, and that was an open adoption. And we did have a relationship with her birth mother. Before the adoption, we were in the delivery room with her and her birth mom when she was born. I was very curious because it was in the first days of open adoption. I thought, I know we're trailblazers. This thing is new. What's it going to be like, not just for me, but for other people? And at a personal level, I actually found it very helpful to meet so many other families who had brand new open adoptions of infants and to find out what the themes in the journey were like from their perspectives. It was illuminating. And it was heartening to see how much other people wanted to tell their story because they wanted to help other people. When they've learned that they could be in a study that would be published and the results of the publication could inform other people entering this new adventure, there was a lot of altruism in their decision to participate, as well as a lot of pleasure, not pleasure, but gratification in being able to tell their story to somebody who was really interested.
Would you mind giving us like a quick breakdown of that study? Like, how long did it go on for? Who was involved? How many people were involved? What were some of the biggest things that you learned and what some of the biggest takeaways are for today's child welfare workforce might be too?
Yeah, right. I had about 9 months to collect and analyze data. So that meant using a snowball sampling method. Which means I contacted various New England agencies that did adoptions, gave them a letter that they could give to people. So that takes time. I ended up with about 22 families, a little bit more, I can't quite remember, because the study went on for 21 years, 22 years before I stopped doing it. So it went pretty much from birth up to age 22 for the adoptees. My cutoff age was birth to age 2, but most of the people I spoke with had children way below age 2.
Okay. All adopted well before age 2 is what you're saying.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. I asked people, how did you pick open adoption? And most of them said they were leery, but they thought this was probably the fastest route to adoption. And they, like me, had the fantasy that if you adopt a newborn, you're less likely to encounter issues of trauma. Because if epigenesis was in the literature back then, it had not entered my consciousness. So they thought that you were more likely to end up with a child who did not have challenges. So that was a surprising finding. But I didn't know that. I didn't know about the challenges until years later. I would go back to the same 22 families. I'm saying 22 because that was the number after 21 years. I just don't recall what the original number was. It might have been 25, something like that. But there was some minor attrition in the sample. One family moved to China, disappeared. The adoptive father disappeared, and the adoptive family was in distress and just didn't want to be in the family anymore, the study anymore. Another one, the adoptive mom herself had been an adoptee and then became an adoptive mom. And she was in the study, but she found it too painful to talk about it. It was trauma triggering for her. And so she dropped out. But for the most part, everybody who was in time 1 ended up being in time 2 and time 3.
Okay.
And the time 3 number was 22.
When you say time 1, time 2, time 3.
I talked to them every 7 years because
every 7 years.
Because I got a sabbatical every 7 years. And I would reapply for a research grant. I was able to publish the data from the first interviews. And then I was able to publish data from the second round of interviews. And then I published data from the third round of interviews. And in the third round of interviews, one of the adoptive fathers said to me, the issue is no longer adoption. It's just life. Life is a challenge. Stuff happens and it's hard. And adoption as an issue just sort of fades into the background.
Well, I was going to ask, what do you think, or did you learn anything? Was there anything that was given by the participants that led to this illumination or this preconceived notion that they thought they were going to have children that didn't have any issues, right? Or any kind of trauma or anything like that they would be shielded from this? How did that kind of come to light during the study?
Initially, the adopting parents were leery, anxious. That was the first set of interviews. And then 7 years later, they were way less anxious. They found out that this works. They had relationships with their children's birth families. There may have been some discomforts along the way, but they felt greatly reassured by reality that birth parents were not intrusive. They were not trying to elbow their way into the adoptive family. They empowered the adoptive parents to be the parents. There was all different kinds of contact. Some families barely had any. Some families were doing vacations together, and birth parents were coming to the kid's birthday party, everything you could imagine in between. And I found that the nature of the contact changed. Whenever I did an interview, I was only getting a snapshot of what it was in that moment. Every family had different kinds of arrangements as time went on. It wasn't static at all.
Okay. And it was all voluntary.
These were all voluntary placements.
Okay.
Well, not all. There was one family that had adopted a 4th child through public child welfare in another New England state, not Rhode Island. And that adoption disrupted. It was really sad.
Yeah.
But all the others were voluntary terminations, which is so unlike in public child welfare, where I don't have my thumb on the temperature in Rhode Island right now. I don't know what the situation is, but for a while there, and maybe it's still going on, in Rhode Island, once we got an open adoption law, which says that if a birth parent voluntarily terminates, then they are guaranteed visitation. It sets people up for trouble. If it's not voluntary, if there's coercion, there's foot dragging. And what makes any adoption work, and especially open adoption, is when the birth parents and the adoptive parents, prospective parents, know what they're getting into. They have full information, and they are empowered to make decisions for themselves that they feel will work for them. And when the adopting parents and the birth parents can talk with each other about what they need and want, and they can agree on something together. When that's mandated, it's very difficult.
Right.
A metaphor would be when there's a divorce and a judge says, you two people can't agree, and so I'm going to tell you what you have to do. And then people are constantly trying to get around that and fighting. And it just requires a lot of careful attention before the adoption is finalized. And the attention needs to be on empowering people to know themselves, to know their own truths, to do the grieving they need to do beforehand. Because that grieving will continue afterwards no matter what you do. That's another myth in adoption.
Yeah.
First you resolve your infertility, and then you can adopt. Infertility is like many other lifelong losses. People can learn to live with it. It moves from the front burner to the back burner, but the heat under that back burner may go up a little bit at certain key moments in life. The myth in the early days of adoption was, for birth parents, you'll get through this experience and then you'll put it behind you. Well, but it's still there, right? Yeah. And it's like any family relationship. Adoption, ideally, is building an extended family of birth relatives and adoptive relatives who work out some kind of rapprochement about what kind of contact they're going to have. So it's a complicated landscape. And when professionals decide what people have to do, it's difficult.
Right.
For example, I don't know if they're still doing it this way in public child welfare, but there have been situations where a birth parent is told, if you agree to do a voluntary TPR, we promise that you will have visitations with your child. But let's say the child is in a foster family that wants to adopt a child, but the foster family doesn't want the visitations. It's a setup for conflict and disappointment. Or worse yet, where it's mandated that the child must participate in visits, but the child doesn't want to.
Right.
And then I've had clients like this where the foster parents or the adoptive parents are required to bring a kicking, screaming child into a visit with a birth parent.
Wow.
That's re-traumatizing a child. I mean, my advice to adoptive parents is if the child doesn't want to do it, don't force it, but keep the door open. Now the parents can visit each other. The adoptive parents can bring photographs or whatever to the visits between the adults and keep reassuring the birth parents that as soon as the kid is ready, visits with the child will continue. There are ways to work it out, but you can only work it out when the adopting parents and the birth parents have a relationship that has some empathy in it, some trust, some honesty. And those things don't happen because somebody requires it. Those things evolve over time.
Right. So knowing those things and knowing from your research and from your own personal experience, what other things can kind of affect or impact the level of involvement of the birth family? And were there other things besides what we've talked about already that affected that level of involvement?
Life affects the level of involvement.
Okay.
You know, sometimes the birth family needs a barrage of letters and pictures in the early days.
Right.
And then their need for that level of information and contact wanes because they discover nobody's going to try to push them out or cut them off. If they need information, they know now they can contact the adopting family and get information. And so they need less because they're reassured. My data show, and my data in the following arena is corroborated by other studies that have happened since I started this, that for the most part over time, the birth family sort of has less contact because their lives take over.
Right.
And life is complicated. They may end up having more children or their own issues with employment or disability or whatever. The contact was generally between the mothers or fathers. I mean, they're really elbowed out of the adoption literature. And mostly mothers were in charge of the cross-family contact.
Right.
But as the kids got older, the adoptive mother gets elbowed out. The kids take over the contact, which is kind of as it should be. The relationship between the birth parents and the adoptive parents in the early stages of the adoption life cycle is really key because the adoptive parents can let go of control of the contact because they know the birth parents. And they know that if there's something that the adoptive parents ought to know, the birth parent's going to tell them.
Right.
Yeah.
What other things, what do you think is sort of lacking in maybe some of the adoption research today? You mentioned fathers. Is there anything else that you feel like is lacking or needs improvement in? We need to find out more information about when it comes to this topic?
I'm a manuscript reviewer for the journal Adoption Quarterly, and I am struck by how deficit-oriented the research is. Who is studying what makes adoption work well? We're studying all kinds of...
Everything that's wrong with it. Right?
Yes. And it's focused on the individual, the characteristics of individuals. It's not focused on the system. We really, really, really need to focus on keeping original families together. It needs to be family preservation before foster care is needed, before adoption is needed. We need to be, I'm talking to an audience probably that knows all this already. Families need enough income. They need social support. They need information and education about parenting. They need schools where kids are safe. They need communities that don't have more guns in them than people. There's just too much going on in the world that stresses people to the limit.
Sure.
Families who give birth to children don't want to lose their kids. If they had access to family planning services, if they had access to terminating pregnancies that they're not ready to carry to term, if they had access to prenatal care.
Right.
We need to do what is necessary to keep families together. And then we avoid all the losses and challenges of adoption.
Right. Knowing that sometimes is unavoidable, unfortunately. What are your best tips and tools and advice that you give to today's child welfare professional to talk to kids, talk to parents, talk to families about the complexities of this process and this topic, and knowing that it is this, we have a whole other episode that will be coming out talking about ambiguous loss. Where do you even start with something like this when you're the professional that's tasked with working with that kid or that family? And where do you even start when talking about what this is going to look like, how you might feel? It's okay to feel that way. Where do we even start?
Where do we start?
Yeah.
I want to start with letting child welfare workers know that I think they have the hardest job possible in social work. My heart goes out to them, and some of my best students ever in the MSW program are from DCYF. They're just brilliant and committed, hardworking. They have emotional intelligence. They have self-awareness. They're just head and shoulders above the crowd. I have tremendous respect and admiration for public child welfare workers. They're awesome. And I know they're doing the best they can under inauspicious circumstances. And they can't do what needs to be done. They need to be spending time with original families, birth families, who are not able to care for a child and who face a termination of parental rights, helping them with the grief and the guilt, the horror of it. I know you read news stories about people giving birth in a toilet or putting a dead baby in a closet and all this stuff. I know stuff happens, but I don't think it's because they didn't want the child. I think they're in a state of absolute trauma and denial. They just can't deal with what's happening. They go into some other headspace. I've worked with a lot of birth parents who are fraught with shame and horror and guilt and self-recrimination, and it comes out in the form of, you are not allowed to take my child. I'll fight this to the bitter end.
Right.
You're the enemy. It's hard to find clinicians really have the deep information about adoption to do the kind of pre-adoption counseling that original parents need, that birth parents need. Because, they're a stigmatized group. How could you do this to a child? How could you give up your own flesh and blood? How could you do this to help? Even what was on the side of buses in Rhode Island for a while said, child abuse, it's a crime. It is a crime, of course. It's horrible and it's unacceptable, and I'm not exonerating it at all. But somebody who's going to abuse a child, there's something amiss. Something's not right.
Right.
And it's hard to look at a highly stigmatized population that does dreadful things to other people. It's hard to look at them through a lens of compassion.
Right.
But I've had many original parents, I've had many of them express great surprise when they talk to me because they didn't want to talk to me. And at the end they go, I didn't think you would understand. I didn't want to have this conversation.
Right.
But this felt okay. This felt good.
Right.
But doing that takes a high level of skill, and you have to have the space in your caseload to do it.
Yeah. Well, it goes, I think, too, so you said deficit-based, right? And I think that it's really, really hard, like you said, to have that compassionate viewpoint of someone who's even if it's involuntary, right? Like it might be something that is just, like you said, life kind of happens and they might not be happy with it and they might not be open to it, but at the end of the day, maybe it is what's best for the child. And so it's just trying to maybe look at that person through a different lens and say, there's all these other challenges and barriers and life circumstances that have come at them, and they're not a bad person necessarily. You know, they're not a bad person. Maybe they've done some bad things or made some mistakes, but we should maybe be looking at them a little bit differently and maybe not blaming them and shaming them and kicking them while they're down, right? Kind of. So
right. It's looking at them through a trauma-informed lens.
Right.
And a lot of us social workers can talk about what trauma-informed is, but when push comes to shove, we don't do it. We're thinking about what's wrong with you as opposed to what happened to you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that person is already going through, like you said, the horror of having to, whether it's voluntary or not, right? You know, like speaking as myself as a new father, like I don't even want to imagine those things. I don't even want to think about those things. Similarly to kids, right? Like how do we talk to kids and how do we help kids like maintain their identities and their own stories if they're in the process of adoption or post-adoption, whatever the case might be, right? Like how do we help them keep the continuity going and so
a really important question, Stan. It's a lifelong process, right? We can start it before the child enters the adoptive family by helping parents know what the child's story is. Truth is very important. And there's a lot of secrets in adoption all over the place. But human beings, I strongly believe, have a right to know their own story. And that can be difficult because some of their original stories are awful. So birth parents and adoptive parents need a lot of careful help. And how do they tell the truth in language that is age appropriate and language that is strengths-based? The people listening to this podcast know all about life books, you know, where the child welfare worker would work with the birth parent and with the pre-adoptive parent on putting together a scrapbook with the child's story. But sometimes the child's story is pretty grim. The two children who watched their birth father murder their birth mother. Did I talk about that?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So I was referred a case by DCYF. The children were adopted by family members, which was great, but they were very tiny when the birth father at home in front of the kids murdered the birth mother. And the kinship adoptive parents came to me like, how do we handle this? And I said, I'm going to have to think about this. I'm not sure.
A little bit of a tough one there.
Right. But I went back to, you have to tell the truth, but it has to be age appropriate and it has to be compassionate. Children don't need to have their original families judged and condemned. That they're going to think then that they come from bad seed or they are bad in some way, and nobody needs to feel that way. So ultimately, not knowing, maybe I didn't handle it right. Who knows? You know, I don't know the long range. I said, well, you've got pictures of the birth. You've got early life childhood pictures. The kids were like 18 months and 2.5 or something. Saw the violence, but had no way of really understanding it probably at those ages. You've got baby pictures. You've got pictures of the birth father. You've got pictures of the birth mother. Put together an album of the family that they came from. And just always keep this album of pictures of where they came from on the bottom shelf of the bookcase so the kids can always pull it out and look at it in their own way, and then put in there the adoption papers and the pictures of the family that they're in now. And there were newspaper articles about the murder. And I said, at some point, you can put the newspaper articles in there, but probably not in early childhood. Maybe the newspaper articles should have been there from the beginning, so as the kids learned to read, they could slowly in their own times. I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I just go back to what are the principles. Children have a right to their own story, tell the truth, do it compassionately and non-judgmentally, use age-appropriate language. Know that a child's awareness is going to change as the brain changes. And I'm discovering now, as the parent of, quote, children who are in their 30s, a person's ability to grasp what happened changes right into adulthood.
Right.
It's not like the brain achieves a certain neurological maturity and then stops. Brain plasticity continues throughout life. And so does one's awareness of one's own adoption story and its impact on one's evolving sense of identity. So my understanding of the intricate complexities of adoption has been a surprise to me. I thought that if I learned enough and studied enough and talked to enough people with lived experience, I'd be able to pin it down. I'd learn it all.
You figured it all.
Exactly. And I am now officially humbled.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it sounds like, I think this is a good sort of lesson or strategy for, in a lot of different cases, right? This is sort of sweeping things under the rug is not going to be helpful in the long run anyway. There are ways, like you said, age appropriate and how and when and time, place, delivery, etc., that we can sort of share, because it is a part of you, and it's we all have a little bit of good and bad and traumas and stuff like that that's happened to us. It's all kind of part of our individual makeup. And so hiding that, it's sort of like suppressing emotions and stuff like that isn't going to really be healthy for you in the long run anyway.
Well said.
Yeah. But we talked a lot about the relationship, just, talking kind of almost exclusively about biological families and adoptive families. But there's the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. So, what does that mean to you in the context of adoption? And what do you think that should mean to others?
Right. So we all need a village. And I think adoptive families are no different. And in some ways, they need a better village, a better informed village.
How does that happen? What does that look like?
Right. How does that happen? Well, we probably need a different culture and a different political, economic environment for that to happen. We all know somebody who has been adopted for the most part. They're like 2 to 4% of the American population. I was going to say is adopted, but I don't like to say it that way, has experienced adoption. Adoption is not what you are. It's a thing that happened to you. We all know adoptive parents. And the fact is we all know people who've lost a child to adoption. But that status is so stigmatized, they don't tell you.
What do we need as a larger society? Because I think you were sort of kind of getting to that, right, and answering, like, what does the general population, the other people that interact, and like you said, we may never know if somebody was adopted, or the chances are that we have somebody in our lives that has gone through adoption. Like, what do we need to know about being supportive for them? What do we need to know about, being respectful of their journey and having that trauma-informed lens for the general population? What is it that we need to do as a larger, society?
Right. Well, we need to stop asking intrusive questions. We need to be mindful of our language. If you say to a child, well, who's your real mother? Or why'd they give you away? My answer to that is, well, every adoptee has 2 real mothers. The real mother who gave birth to them and the real mother who is raising and nurturing them.
Sure. And it's sort of the general population, people are looking at it that way, or there's still a lot of work that needs to be done?
Oh, there's so much work.
The people in general, John Doe down the street, understand it. They don't look at it that way.
That's right. And we should be way less judgmental of people who have mental health challenges, learning differences, and who are of color or low income, because when we make smearing statements about other populations of people, an adoptee may know that it was substance use that led to their adoption, and they feel like they're being shamed. We're doing damage to them when we say racist things, and a child knows that they're like 25% whatever.
Right.
We need to work on our own human sensitivities, I think, in general.
Right.
And we need to have a better appreciation about ambiguous loss, as you identified earlier. In one situation, a really wonderful kindergarten teacher was trying to comfort a child who started to cry in class, and the teacher goes over and says, "What's the matter, honey?" And the kid says, "I miss my birth mother." And the teacher says, "But there's nothing to miss, honey. You have such wonderful parents now." But that disenfranchises that child's grief.
Sure.
What the teacher needs to know to say is, those are very real feelings. Those are very special feelings. And I'm sure you do miss your birth parents. And I'm glad you could tell me that.
Right.
And just leave it at that.
Yeah.
As opposed to dismissing this outpouring of grief.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about in that podcast too is just like our desire to always want to try to fix things. And I think there's a level of that too, right? We want to try to fix it. We want to try to make it better, offer something that is in our minds helpful. And it's really not. It's really kind of doing the opposite as opposed to just validating those feelings and those emotions, right?
Right. Well, we're a quick fix culture.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing that with a hip issue that I'm having. I have some mild arthritis in the hip, nothing serious enough to get a hip replacement. But if I tell anybody, "Oh, my hip is killing me," they go, "Are you going to have a hip replacement?" They leap right over
to the solution.
To the solution, which is not a solution.
Or the perceived solution.
It's not a solution.
Or from what their experience might be with themselves or their families or whatever. So they think that if that was helpful for them, it must be helpful for you, right?
That's right.
So, and that's not always the case. I think we tend to kind of do that a lot in society, right? With other people, we're trying so hard, and I think it's not even bad intentions, right? We're just trying to relate. We're trying to be helpful, but we're not seeing the bigger picture. We're almost making it a little bit worse. It's like, that's not what I want to hear. I don't want to hear I need a hip replacement, or I don't want to hear that like my adoptive parents are all that I need now, because I'm telling you that I miss my biological parents, and that's what matters to me, like in this moment, right? So, and I'm sad about that now. So, yeah, I think we do that a lot, and it's just sort of those knee-jerk reactions of we want to make it better, or we want to fix it, or we want to offer some advice that's sort of misguided.
We're trying to comfort ourselves when we say those things.
Exactly.
And then we'll think about that child who's crying in kindergarten. How could you miss somebody you never knew? Well, you can.
Yeah. Is there any other advice or strategies you want to sort of give to our friends at DCYF?
Well, just how much I admire and appreciate what they're doing. They are so unappreciated, and they're blamed for bad outcomes when they had no control over the outcome. And, it's like, it's tough work. It's tough work. The fear of removing a child from a family where the child is being neglected or abused, knowing that the child may be languishing now in congregate care and never finding a family, but being terrified of leaving the child where the child is because it's unacceptable care, and having to make those kinds of decisions.
Impossible decisions, right? Like no win scenarios.
Right, no win, and it's soul crushing. It takes a lot of intestinal fortitude, a lot of skill, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of tolerance of intolerable uncertainty and ambiguity. There's so much more to say, but when you get me talking about adoption, you're looking for the off button. Yeah. Make her stop, make her stop.
We could go on and on and on. Well, thank you, Deborah. We appreciate it. And we hope to talk to you again soon.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Take care.